I've started this 4 times. The first version was 3 pages long and read like an incident report. Dates, times, weather conditions, gauge readings. The kind of documentation I produce in my sleep. The kind I could file with my eyes closed after 11 years in the field. I got to week 6 and deleted it because reading it back felt like listening to someone describe a car accident in terms of tire pressure and road friction. Technically accurate, completely wrong. The second version I tried to write the way I actually remember it, the smell of the place, the particular quality of the silence at the gauge each morning, the weight of the orange flag in my hand. That one I deleted after 2 paragraphs because it sounded like I was losing my mind. And I am not losing my mind. That matters to me, probably more than it should. The third version I never finished. I got as far as the first anomalous gauge reading and stopped because I realized I was doing the same thing again, building the same documentation system, constructing the same analysis, following the same professional instinct that put me in this situation in the first place. This is the 4th version. I'm starting it differently this time. I'm starting with the thing I know for certain, which is this. There was a rule book on the desk when I arrived at Thunderhead Prong backcountry ranger station. 7 rules, laminated, pinned to a corkboard on the west wall. 6 of those rules made sense to me within my first week. The 7th, the one labeled Rule Number 5, I am still trying not to finish explaining. That's the factual version. That's also, somehow, the honest one. I don't know which part of what happened is the horror exactly, whether it's what I found in the old logbooks, or what I heard at the tree line, or what was written in my handwriting by something that wasn't me. I've turned all of it over for 4 months now, the way you work a knot with your fingers in the dark, feeling for the one loop that will let everything else go. I haven't found it yet. I'm starting to think that's the point. The last normal thing I remember is the smell of the road. Not the Smokies specifically, just that particular combination of elevation change and October air. The way the temperature drops by 5 degrees every 1,000 feet of altitude, and the pine resin gets sharper as you climb. I've driven roads like that all my life. Western North Carolina, eastern Tennessee, the high ridge country where both states press up against each other, and the mountains don't care about the boundary. I know that smell the way I know my own handwriting. It meant I was going to work. It meant something needed documenting. I'd loaded my truck the night before, everything on my gear list, which I had reviewed twice against the station's posted supply inventory. 12-week pack of food staples, backup propane canisters, waterproof field journals, 3 of them, more than I'd need. But I don't like running short on documentation space. A full first aid kit, a handheld GPS as backup to the station's fixed compass points, rain gear rated to sustained 40-degree exposure, my personal reference library, which runs to 4 books, and a laminated trail index I've been updating since 2017. I had my assignment sheet, my seasonal contract, my district contact numbers, and my personal emergency protocol card, which I fill out at the start of every new posting and keep in my breast pocket. Name, blood type, assigned station, next of kin. I've done this so many times, the card is a muscle memory rather than a precaution. The Thunderhead Prong trailhead is a gravel pull-off on a 2-lane road that doesn't appear on most consumer maps. There's a wooden kiosk, a bear box, and a permit registration tube that was half full of soggy backcountry passes from the previous week. I spent 5 minutes pulling the old passes, sorting them by campsite number, and tucking them into an evidence bag for cross-referencing later. Standard procedure. I was good at standard procedure. There was a handwritten note taped to the inside of the kiosk's plexiglass panel. Notebook paper, blue pen, block letters. It said only, "Good luck." I assumed someone had taped it there for the hikers. I almost didn't take note of it at all. I shouldered my pack, 53 pounds, which is heavy for a solo approach, but I've carried worse, and started the 7-mile trail in. The station was smaller than I expected, and cleaner than any backcountry outpost I had ever worked. That's the detail that lodged in my mind first, even before the corkboard, even before the rulebook. Cleanliness, the kind that comes not from recent effort, but from long habit, the kind of order that has been maintained so consistently it has become structural. The propane lines were coiled and tagged. The hand pump well had a clean catch basin with no standing water. The porch boards were swept. The single window facing the drainage corridor was closed and latched. The firewood stack under the east overhang was face-stacked with the bark side out. The way you stack wood when you care about it lasting. Someone had kept this station very carefully. Someone had been here recently enough that the careful habits had held. Inside, the desk was clear, except for 2 things: the open logbook and the field radio, which was set to the correct district frequency and showed a green power indicator. I noted both. The corkboard covered most of the west wall. From where I stood in the doorway, I could see that it was covered in laminated sheets, more than most stations carry, and organized in a way that was not quite alphabetical and not quite operational priority. It had its own logic I would need to spend time with. The logbook was open to a blank page, not mid-entry, not abandoned, open deliberately, the way you open a journal for someone you know is coming. The previous entry was dated 6 weeks prior to my arrival. It was short, professional format, correct notation, nothing anomalous in the weather or trail condition data. The last line read, "Closing out. Read the board. Not refer to posted protocols or see corkboard for current operational guidelines. Not standard station handoff language at all. Read the board." I set my pack against the south wall, sat down at the desk, and opened my field journal to page 1. I wrote the date, the time, the temperature reading from the porch thermometer, and the trail conditions I had observed on the approach. 7 miles of good trail. No blowdown. 1 section of wet footing near the tributary sea crossing. Campsite 24 signage still intact. Then I turned to the corkboard. I have a system for reading new station protocols. I go through them once fast for general orientation. Then I go through them again slowly, flagging anything that requires clarification or seems inconsistent with district-level guidelines I already know. It's the same approach I use for incident reports, for trail condition assessments, for search and rescue timelines. You read for the shape first, then you read for the gaps. The Thunderhead Prong corkboard had permit maps, a current blowdown registry that was 2 seasons out of date, a laminated bare corridor chart for spring activity I'd need to update that a water quality notice for Tributary C, and 7 rules. Each rule was on its own laminated sheet, numbered, arranged left to right in numerical order. Whoever had organized the board had arranged them with care. Rule number 1. Do not leave the station between 2200 and 0500. If an emergency requires you to leave, take the orange flag from the south porch hook and carry it at all times. Do not set it down. I flagged the flag. Specific object, specific prohibition. That wasn't protocol language, I recognized, but I'd worked remote enough stations to know that highly specific rules usually come from highly specific incidents. Someone, at some point, had set something down that they shouldn't have. I filed that without judgment and moved on. Rule number 2. If you hear your name spoken from the tree line after dark, do not respond and do not look toward the sound. Complete whatever task you are currently doing and return inside without changing your pace. The specificity of your name gave me a moment of pause. Not a voice, not an unusual sound. Your name. That implied knowledge, something knowing in advance who was posted here. I noted it and kept reading. Rule number 3. The water gauge at Tributary C must be read at exactly 0630 each morning. If the reading is between 2.7 and 2.9 feet, do not enter the tributary drainage that day for any reason. Log the reading, file it in your daily report, and remain on the main trail system. The measurement range stopped me for longer. Above 3.0 feet is a standard flood protocol threshold. Between 2.7 and 2.9 is not a hydrological warning. It's too narrow and too specific. It measures something the gauge designers did not design the gauge to measure. I put a small asterisk in my field journal. Rule number 4. If a visitor reports seeing a ranger in the backcountry who is not you, take their name and campsite number. Thank them, and do not follow up. Do not file an incident report. Do not radio it in. I read that one twice. Active suppression of an incident report is not a safety protocol. It's the opposite of a safety protocol. It's the kind of instruction that gets written when something has been decided above the station level. When someone with authority looked at the reports being filed and decided they were causing more problems than they were solving. I put a second asterisk, a larger one. Rule number 6. If the field radio produces a voice during a scheduled dead period, any time other than your 0700 and 1900 check-ins, do not respond. Turn the radio off. Wait 45 minutes before turning it back on. If the voice is still present, leave the station and walk the South Trail until it stops. The 45-minute window felt calibrated. Someone had timed it. Rule number 7. When you leave this station for the last time, do not look back at the building. Walk to the trailhead. Do not stop. I read that one 3 times. Every other rule on the board governed behavior during the posting. This one governed the departure. I stood at the corkboard for a moment with my field journal open and my pen raised and didn't write anything. Then I turned to rule number 5. The rules were numbered 1 through 7. Rule number 5 read, "Do not ask what rule number 5 is for." That was all. No operational instruction. No behavioral directive. No context. One sentence, and that sentence was not a rule, it was a prohibition against seeking one. The other rules told me what to do, what not to do, under what specific conditions, and in what specific order. This one only told me not to wonder. I noticed the lamination. The sheet for rule number 5 was older than the others, not dramatically, not visibly from across the room, but up close the plastic had yellowed at the corners in the particular way that older thermal laminate does. The way that tells you it was sealed years before the rest. The others looked like they'd been done at the same time. Same laminator, same plastic stock. Rule number 5 had been laminated separately, earlier, which meant it had been written before the others, or after them, but processed first, or by a different person at a different time. I stood at the corkboard for 4 minutes. I know it was 4 minutes because I checked the time when I stopped reading, and again when I made my first logbook entry, and the gap was 4 minutes and some seconds. 4 minutes is a long time to stare at 12 words. What it provoked in me was not unease. Not then. What it provoked was the specific professional discomfort I feel when I encounter a gap in a system I'm supposed to operate the sensation of reaching for a tool on my belt and finding the loop empty. An unexplained rule in an operational rule book is not mysterious. It is defective. It is a liability. I cannot train a replacement on a rule I cannot explain. I cannot defend it in a post-incident review. I cannot endorse it in a district protocol audit. I can follow it, provisionally, the way I follow any provisional protocol, with the understanding that I am going to track down the rationale before I sign anything that implies I've validated it. I put 3 asterisks next to my note on rule number 5. My first logbook entry at Thunderhead Prong Station is dated October 4th. It is, by any professional measure, a clean and complete document. Trail conditions on approach? Good. Tributary sea crossing. Wet footing. Safe passage. Station condition on arrival. Good. Equipment inventory. Complete. Previous logbook entry reviewed. Yes. Discrepancies. None. Blowdown registry. Flagged for update. At the bottom, below the formal notation, I wrote 1 personal addendum in smaller print. I do this at every station, a private audit note, not intended for the official record, something to follow up on. Rule number 5. Source unknown. Format inconsistent with other posted rules. Lamination older than remainder of board. Recommend clarification from district office. I filed my arrival check-in at 1900, exactly on schedule. The radio worked cleanly. The dispatcher, a woman named Terry, who I'd spoken to maybe 3 times across 2 previous postings, confirmed my contact frequencies, gave me the current weather window, and noted there was a solo backpacker with a permit for campsite 24, already 2 days into a 5-day trip. I said, I have a question about the posted rules at this station. Specifically, rule number 5. There was a pause. It wasn't a long pause. 3 seconds, maybe 4. The kind of pause that, in field communication, you chalk up to radio latency or someone checking a screen. But Terry's radio connection was clear and clean. No latency all season. I clocked that pause the moment it happened, and I have never fully stopped thinking about it. She said, just follow what's on the board. Not I'll look into that, or I'm not familiar with that protocol, or even could you repeat the rule number. She knew exactly which rule I was asking about. She knew the answer she was going to give before I finished the sentence. I said, "Copy that, because I am a professional. And that is what you say." After the radio clicked off, I sat at the desk in the quiet of the station and looked at my field journal. The forest outside the window had gone dark in the 20 minutes since I'd arrived. The porch light threw a clean circle on the gravel, about 8 feet out. And past that edge, the darkness was the kind that has real weight, the total absence of artificial light that you only find 7 miles from a paved road in a mountain drainage corridor. I was going to ask again later. I always followed up on gaps in operational documentation. That was not stubbornness. That was professional responsibility. I wrote the date on page 2 of my field journal, opened a fresh section for personal notes, and at the top of the page I wrote, "Rule number 5, start here. Here is what the first 2 weeks actually looked like before anything else, because I want you to understand that the job was real. The forest was real. The work was exactly as grounded and physical and ordinary as any backcountry ranger posting I've had, and I've had 6. 6:30 each morning. Tributary sea gauge reading. The gauge is a staff plate mounted to a concrete footing at the bend where the main trail crosses the drainage. A white fiberglass rod marked in 1/10 of a foot, standing in whatever water the overnight precipitation left behind. October is a shoulder season month in the Smokies. The readings ran between 0.4 and 0.8 feet most mornings, shallow and clear. The drainage running over a flat rock shelf that amplified the water sound in a way that made the creek seem louder than it was. I logged each reading in my notebook and transferred it to the daily report at 0700. 0700. Radio check-in, trail conditions, weather, any overnight permit arrivals flagged in the backcountry system. Terry, or one of 2 other dispatchers, brief, professional, always ending with, "Copy Thunderhead. Stand by until 1900. The middle hours were field work. I walked the main trail system in sections 3 miles north toward Bota Mountain Junction the first week, south toward the watershed boundary the second. I posted a bear activity warning at the Bota Mountain Junction after finding fresh claw marks on a beech tree at trail marker 12. I documented 2 sections of late-season blowdown from a wind event that had come through 10 days before I arrived. Photographed both. Measured the largest downed section at 31 feet. I cross-referenced the campsite 24 permit against the backpacker I'd been flagged on, found him on day 3, healthy, well-equipped, slightly confused about the tributary crossing route. We talked for maybe 8 minutes. He was a retired school teacher from Knoxville who did a solo Smokies trip every October. He'd been doing it for 19 years. He knew this trail better than I did. The evenings had a rhythm. 1900 check-in, log update, dinner on the propane stove. The kind of silence that fills a 1-room timber station when you've been in it for 8 hours and nobody is coming. I was cautious about calling it peace. I didn't trust my own interpretation of it. But there were nights in those first 2 weeks when I sat on the covered porch with my second cup of coffee and listened to the drainage and thought that the posting might be exactly what I needed. Remote, accountable only to protocol, no team to manage or second-guess me. No recovery operation ticking down to a 72-hour threshold in the back of my mind. Just the work. Just the rules. Just the gauge in the morning and the radio at 7. But I was also, the entire time, still thinking about rule number 5. On my 9th morning, the tributary sea gauge read 2.8 feet. I checked it twice. I crouched at the edge of the drainage and looked at the staff plate from 2 angles, in case I was misreading a waterline stain for a current level. I was not misreading it. The gauge read 2.8 feet, clearly and unambiguously, and the drainage was dry. Not low, not barely flowing. Dry. The flat rock shelf was uncovered, the pebble bed completely exposed, the concrete footing of the gauge plate sitting in open air with no waterline at all. The reading was physically impossible. A staff plate gauge measures the water surface against its markings. There was no water surface. There was no water. I stood at the gauge for longer than I should have, long enough to feel the cold coming off the shadowed drainage wall, long enough to hear the tributary above the gauge, which was running distantly with normal October flow. The sound was coming from the right direction. The drainage below me was dry. I reread rule number 3 in my field journal. If the reading is between 2.7 and 2.9 feet, do not enter the tributary drainage that day for any reason. I was not going to enter the tributary drainage. The tributary drainage was dry. There was, by any practical measure, no operational reason to enter a dry drainage corridor in October. I logged the reading as an equipment anomaly, possible gauge calibration failure, recommend technician inspection, and filed it in my 0700 report. My supervisor didn't respond to it. Not that day, not the following week. I noted that too. I did not enter the tributary drainage. I told myself that was because it was dry, and there was no fieldwork reason to be there. That was partially true. The other part I didn't write down yet. On my 11th day, I was conducting a welfare check at Campsite 24 when the backpacker I'd spoken to, the retired school teacher, Clarence, told me something with the easy, casual certainty of someone sharing a minor logistical observation. He said he'd passed another ranger on the Bote Mountain Trail that morning around 0830. Friendly, professional, walking away from him on the trail that dead ends at the drainage wall. Same uniform as mine. Badge number he hadn't caught clearly. The ranger had been walking away when Clarence noticed the badge was there. He'd assumed the ranger was heading to a work site up the drainage. He'd waved. The ranger had not waved back, but Clarence figured they just hadn't seen him. I wrote down his name, his campsite number. I thanked him. I stood on the trail after he walked back toward his camp, looking toward Bote Mountain. The junction was visible from where I stood, a wooden sign, 2 trails diverging, both of them open and empty in the mid-morning light. The trail that ran towards the drainage wall was a spur I had walked on day 3. It dead-ended at a rock face approximately 200 yards in. There was no work site. There was no reason for a ranger to be on that trail. There was no other ranger assigned to this station. Per rule number 4, I took Clarence's name and campsite number. I thanked him. I did not file an incident report. I did not radio it in. What I did instead was go back to the station and write it in my personal log. All of it, the description Clarence gave, the time, the location, the fact that the badge number was illegible, the fact that the trail dead-ended. I wrote it in the kind of detail I used to use for search and rescue timelines. Exact, sequential, sourced. I told myself I was keeping a record for my own reference. I stood on the trail for a long moment before I turned back. The forest was dense on both sides of the Bote Mountain Junction, the canopy heavy enough that the sky was just a pale corridor overhead. The trees on the drainage side were absolutely still. I had the feeling, which I will not call certainty because I don't deal in things I can't document, that something was watching me watch the trail. I turned and walked back to the station. The radio call came in at 22:47 on a Thursday. A day hiker, he'd identified himself as Marcus. He'd given me a vehicle description and a parking spot at the trailhead. He was audibly tense, but controlled, told me his hiking partner had left their camp near the station at 2000 for what was supposed to be a 30-minute walk. It was now 22:47. She hadn't returned. He'd called out from camp for 20 minutes before he'd thought to use his emergency satellite communicator to reach the dispatch relay. I looked at the orange flag on the south porch hook. I knew rule number 1, 2200 to 0500, do not leave the station. If an emergency requires it, take the flag and carry it at all times. Do not set it down. I also knew that a missing person at 90 minutes overdue in 40-degree October darkness is not a suggestion. It's a welfare check that I am contractually and professionally obligated to initiate. I am a trained search and rescue coordinator. I have conducted 43 formal search operations and dozens of informal welfare checks. I have called off exactly one, and I have never stopped thinking about it. I was not going to stay inside and wait for morning. I took the orange flag from the south porch hook. It was heavier than it looked thick canvas, a solid wooden dowel mounted to a clip bracket. I held it in my left hand. I turned on my headlamp, checked my radio, pulled on my rain shell against the night cold, and walked off the porch into the dark. The trail to Marcus's camp ran north from the station. The porch light was behind me within 40 steps. The forest closed on both sides quickly and completely. And the darkness past my headlamp beam had the particular density of mountain drainage darkness. No reflected ambient light, no horizon glow, nothing. Just the beam and the black. I kept the flag in my left hand. The canvas was stiff against my palm. I didn't think about why I was keeping it. I just kept it. The trail to Marcus's camp crossed a wide, flat section of the main creek at about the half-mile mark, not a bridge crossing, just a stepstone route across a shallow shelf where the current spread thin over flat rock. During daylight, with dry boots, it's a 2-minute crossing. In the dark, with a headlamp and 53-pound instincts, it's considerably more careful work. The footing was slick, the stepstones were wet, and the headlamp threw shadows that made depth judgment difficult. I stood at the bank and made a practical decision. I needed both hands on my trekking poles for this crossing. The rocks were small, and the channel was wide. I set the orange flag down on a dry, flat rock at the edge of the bank, propped it against a boulder so it wouldn't fall, and crossed in 30 seconds, clean and fast, no misstep. I picked the flag back up on the other side without breaking stride. I told myself it didn't matter. I'd set it down for 30 seconds on a dry rock 2 feet from where I was standing. I found Marcus's partner. Her name was Simone. She was 27. She had a mild ankle sprain from stepping off the trail edge in the dark 200 yards past the crossing. Sitting against a tree with her headlamp blinking its low battery warning. She was cold but entirely coherent. She had turned around twice and lost her direction reference because the sound of the creek kept arriving from the wrong angle. That's a real phenomenon in this drainage corridor. Sound behaves strangely. Here the topography bends acoustic lines in ways that make the creek seem like it's behind you when it's ahead, off to the left when it's to the right. I walked her back to camp. She leaned on my arm for the last quarter mile. I radioed in the all clear at 0034 and stood with Marcus while he made tea on his camp stove and said thank you 3 times in the way people say it when they mean it. I walked back to the station. I still had the flag. At 06:15 the next morning, I went to rehang the orange flag on the south porch hook before my gauge reading. The bracket that mounted the hook to the exterior wall had been bent outward. Not broken, not snapped at the base or stress fractured, bent in a smooth arc that pointed the hook away from the wall at roughly 40 degrees. The kind of bend you'd expect from sustained lateral pressure. The kind of force that doesn't punch through, but leans and holds. The wood around the bracket showed no tool marks, no pry damage. The surrounding boards were undamaged. There were no scratches, no scuff marks, no evidence of impact against the wall surface. Just the bracket, pulled outward in that clean, insistent curve. I stood on the porch and looked at it for a long time. Then I photographed it with my field camera, 4 angles, scale reference against my boot. Then I filed it in my maintenance log as probable storm damage from the wind event 2 weeks prior, which is what I wrote, and is not what I believed. The wind event was 14 days before I arrived. No other hardware on the station showed any damage. The porch was solid on every other surface. There had been no significant weather the night before. Something had pressed against that bracket from outside. Not long enough to break it, long enough to bend it, long enough to test what was there and register, in some way I can't verify, that the usual marker was gone. I went inside and read the rules again, all 7 of them, in order, from the beginning. I did not read them the same way I had on the first day. The tributary sea gauge read 2.8 feet again on the morning of October 13th. I had been tracking the anomalous readings since the first one, in a small personal spreadsheet I'd started in the back of my field journal, the kind of informal, parallel record I keep when I find something in operational data that doesn't fit the official framework. Date, time, upstream precipitation in the previous 24 hours, ambient temperature, drainage conditions at the time of reading. On October 9th, no precipitation, 44 degrees Fahrenheit, drainage dry. On October 13th, no precipitation, 41 degrees Fahrenheit, drainage dry. The reading was 2.8 feet both times, exactly to the 10th foot mark. The readings had never occurred during daylight hours, I noted. Both had been at the 06:30 scheduled reading, which was dawn adjacent in October, but technically still pre-light, in the deep drainage corridor. I had never gotten an anomalous reading at the midday spot check I sometimes added after weather events. I also noticed, the second time, a quality to the stillness around the gauge that I found difficult to write in notation language. Not the stillness of an empty drainage, the stillness of a space where something recently moved and has stopped. The stillness of an interrupted action. I'm aware of how that sounds. I put it in the personal log, not the official one, in careful language. Tributary sea vicinity, 0633. Unusual acoustic profile. No bird activity in a 100-meter radius. No wind movement in canopy, despite 8 miles per hour recorded at station. Gauge reading 2.8 feet. Drainage visibly dry. Duration of atypical conditions. Approximately 4 minutes post-reading. I did not enter the drainage. I logged the reading and walked back on the main trail. On the 22nd evening, at 20:45, while I was at the gauge for a supplemental reading I'd added to my personal tracking schedule, I heard my name. It came from the eastern tree line, 20 meters off the trail. A woman's voice, calm, slightly breathless, the particular breathlessness of someone who has been moving at a sustained pace and has just arrived, just crested a small rise or rounded a bend, and is relieved to see a light ahead. The exact inflection of relief, the exact tone of someone who knows the person they're calling. It said, Mara, once, clear. No distortion, no echoing off the drainage walls, no acoustic bending of the kind that had confused Simone's sense of direction 2 weeks prior. Just my name, from 20 meters away in the eastern tree line, in a voice I had never heard before that somehow sounded like it had known me for years. I was crouching at the gauge. I had my notebook in my right hand, my pen in my left. I wrote the reading. I wrote it carefully, the way I always do, checking the staff plate twice and recording the number with the time in the margin. 2045, 0.7 feet. Normal. I closed the notebook. I stood up. Every professional instinct I have, 11 years of it, 43 formal operations, the specific neural pathway that processes woman, distress, alone in the dark, and fires a response before I can form a conscious thought. Every single one told me to turn toward that tree line. Rule number 2 told me not to. I completed whatever task I was currently doing. I began walking back to the station at an unchanged pace. I kept my headlamp forward. The eastern tree line was to my right for approximately 60 meters of that walk, and for 60 meters, I did not turn my head a single degree in that direction. I counted my footsteps. I kept my pace even. I put one boot in front of the other, and I did not look. The voice did not speak again. I don't know how long I sat at the desk before I opened the logbook. When I did, I found I couldn't write in field notation. The notation style requires a specific mode of processing observation, reduced to data, event reduced to measurement. Everything translated into the kind of language that travels cleanly from the field to the official record. That mode was not available to me. I sat with my pen touching the page for what felt like a long time, and then I just wrote. Tonight, at 20:45, during the supplemental tributary gauge reading, I heard my name spoken from the eastern tree line. One occurrence, clear vocalization, female sounding, calm inflection, no distortion. I completed the reading and returned to the station per rule number 2. I did not look towards the sound. I did not respond. Then I wrote. The voice did not sound like a threat. It sounded like someone who had been walking for a long time and was glad to see me. I don't know how to document that distinction, except to say that I know the difference, professionally, between a frightened person calling out and an exhausted person calling out. This sounded like the second one. Then, if I was wrong, if that was a person, I don't know how I come back from that. I sat with that sentence for a while. Then I wrote below it, in handwriting that was slightly smaller than the rest, as if I was trying to keep it contained. I know what Donnie Ortega's family felt. I had never written that name in any logbook, official, personal, or otherwise. I had typed it into 47 database searches in the 11 months since I called off the search. I had said it out loud to my supervisor, to the incident review board, to the victim's family coordinator, in the careful professional language of a post-incident debrief. I had never once written it in my own handwriting, in my own journal, at my own desk. I closed the logbook. I did not sleep well. In the morning, I decided I needed to talk to someone who had worked this station before me. Someone who had stood at that gauge and heard something from the tree line and understood what rule number 2 was actually protecting. I needed to know if they had made it out. On my next resupply run to the trailhead, day 28, a clear Tuesday, cold enough for gloves, on the trail, I sat in my truck with my phone and a cellular connection I hadn't had in 4 weeks and searched for former rangers at Thunderhead Prong backcountry station. The NPS Public Records Database is not designed for this kind of search. The staff assignment histories for individual backcountry stations are not publicly archived in any organized way. What you can find are names in old Park Service reports, infrastructure projects, trail rerouting documentation, partnership grant filings. If someone worked at a station long enough to be cited in a report, their name exists. I found Dale Pruitt in a 2003 trail rerouting report for the Thunderhead watershed corridor, former district supervisor, cited as a senior reviewer on the project. 11 years of service listed. That put his active tenure in the late 90s and early 2000s. The phone number I found for him was in a retired federal employees directory, the kind that stays online because no one bothers to take it down. I called it without a clear plan for what I was going to say. He answered on the second ring. I said, "My name is Mara Calloway. I'm a seasonal ranger at Thunderhead Prong backcountry station." There was a pause. Not the 3-second Terry pause, a full beat. Then, "How long have you been out there?" Not "who gave you this number?" or "how can I help you?" or any version of the ordinary opening a retired federal employee uses when a stranger calls. He asked how long I'd been there, like it was the only relevant variable. I told him 6 weeks. He exhaled a long, careful breath, the kind you release when a number comes in lower than you feared. He said, "Have you asked about rule number 5 yet?" He confirmed the other ranger sightings first. He called them the figure, never the entity, never something, just the figure. And he told me they went back at least to the mid-'80s in the records he'd been able to access. Always the same description, same uniform, wrong badge number, walking away from the witness on a trail with no exit. He had personally reviewed 4 visitor reports during his tenure that matched the description, all of them filed in violation of Rule Number 4 by rangers who hadn't been properly briefed on the protocol, or who had decided the rule didn't apply because the sighting had been witnessed by a civilian and not the ranger themselves. He told me about the 1991 incident with the flatness of someone who had processed it so many times it had stopped having texture. A junior ranger, he wouldn't give me the name, said he'd given his word, had filed a formal incident report after a figure sighting, and included in the report a detailed physical description, a timeline, and a personal assessment of what the figure might be. The ranger was pulled from the station within 48 hours of filing. No official explanation was given to the remaining staff. Dale had been a junior district employee in 1991. He had been told it was a reassignment for personal reasons, and he had been told this clearly enough that he understood he should not ask follow-up questions. He told me he had left the station himself 6 weeks before his own contract ended, which I noted was exactly the same early departure gap as my predecessor, because he felt the posting was changing how he thought. I asked him what that meant. He said, I was thinking differently. Not about the rules, about everything. The way I processed information, the way I made decisions. Like something had been running alongside my reasoning for so long that it had started to incorporate the shape of it. I wrote that down. I wrote every word of it. I asked him about Rule Number 5. He was quiet for long enough that I checked my phone screen to make sure the call was still connected. Then he said, I'm not going to talk about Rule Number 5. I said, can you tell me who wrote it? Or when? No. Can you tell me what it's protecting? The rule isn't protecting you from it, he said. That's the thing they don't tell you when you get that posting. They let you assume all the rules are oriented the same way toward keeping you safe. Rule Number 5 isn't oriented that way. Then what is it oriented toward? I can't explain it without explaining it, he said. And I'm not going to do that to you. There was a quality to his voice that I recognized from field work. The sound of a person maintaining composure over something they have been maintaining composure over for a very long time. Not fragile, not frightened, just very, very careful. Before he hung up, he said, don't write everything down. Whatever you do out there, don't write everything down. I said, thank you. I said I would be careful. I said I appreciated his time, the way you say things professionally when the conversation has come to its end. After the call, I sat in my truck at the trailhead for a while. The October light was going early, the mountain shadow reaching the parking area by 4:30. I watched it cross the gravel. Then I drove to the nearest grocery store, resupplied in 40 minutes, drove back to the trailhead, and walked the 7 miles back to the station in the failing light with my headlamp on for the last mile and a half. When I sat down at the desk, I opened my field journal and wrote down everything Dale Pruitt had said. Every word, his exact phrasing, his pauses and their approximate length. I wrote at the top of the page, don't write everything down. Then I filled 6 pages below it. The logbooks were not hidden. I want to be clear about that, because in retrospect, there is a version of this story where the discovery feels like the finding of a buried thing, a suppressed record, a secret someone tried to conceal. That's not what happened. The logbooks were on the storage shelf behind the propane supply, 6 of them, stacked flat, under 2 empty fuel canisters and a box of trail marker staples. They were there because that is where old station records go when the desk logbook fills up. The station had no formal archive system. Full logbooks went to the back shelf. New ones went to the desk. The most recent one had been on the desk when I arrived, open to a blank page. I found the stack on my 32nd day, looking for a backup propane regulator. I lifted the fuel canisters, saw the logbooks, and sat down on the floor of the station with all 6 of them arranged in date order in front of me. The oldest ran from the spring of 1988 to the fall of that same year. The newest ended in June of 2019, 3 years before my current posting. Between them, 1993, 2001, 2009, 2014. 31 years of rangers at this station, documented in 6 books. Each book covered roughly 1 season. I opened the 1988 book first, in the particular careful way I open things I know might be significant, spine down, both hands, no cracking. The first entry was methodical and professional. The handwriting small and consistent. The notation format clean. Standard ranger documentation. Gauge readings, permit checks, blowdown notes, weather. I turned pages. 3 weeks in, the entries were still clean. 4 weeks in, first anomalous gauge reading, logged as equipment error. 5 weeks in, the handwriting changed. I read all 6 books in one sitting. It took most of the night. The pattern was the same in every one of them, across 31 years and 6 different rangers. It ran like a template I hadn't been given. Weeks 1 through 3, clean professional documentation, standard notation, operational reports filed on schedule. Week 3 or 4, first anomalous tributary C reading, logged as equipment error. No follow-up from district. Then, in every book, one of 2 rule number 2 or rule number 4 entries, not labeled as such, because the rules were not yet formalized in the earliest books, but described in field notation that matched exactly what the rules now addressed. A voice from the tree line. A visitor reporting a second ranger. The ranger logging it without filing an official incident report. In the 1993 book, a notation I read 3 times. Heard my designation called from the eastern tree line at 2012. Did not respond per standing guidance. Continued gauge check. Returned to station. Standing guidance. Which meant by 1993, the verbal protocol was already established before it was laminated. After that entry, in every book, the documentation style shifted. The entries got longer. The notation relaxed. Personal observations crept into the margins. Feelings, physical sensations, patterns the ranger had noticed. Things a professional field log has no category for. In the 2009 book, the shift was the most dramatic. By week 7, the ranger was writing full paragraphs, informal, almost conversational, describing the sound of the drainage at night, describing the way the station felt occupied even when it wasn't. describing a growing compulsion to document that they were actively resisting and losing. Then, in every book, abrupt termination. The last entry was a departure note with no detail. Date, time, departure. That was all. Every book, every ranger, the same arc, one exception. In the 2009 book, the last entry was 3 words, closing out, good luck. And below the ranger's departure notation, in different ink, presumably written after the formal last entry. It needed me to finish the description. I almost did. I found it when I closed the 2009 logbook. A folded square of notebook paper, tucked inside the back cover, held in place by the cover's inner seam. Not a logbook page, different paper stock, different weight, college ruled. It had been folded small and carefully, the way you fold something you want to preserve. I unfolded it at the desk. The handwriting was different from the logbook entries. More compressed, slightly slanted, written quickly but not carelessly. It said, Rule 5 is not a rule about behavior. It is a rule about epistemology. Stop before you understand it. I am writing this for you. Stop before you understand it. Signed with initials only. CV. I searched the name field of every entry in all 6 logbooks. No ranger with those initials. I searched the 2003 trail rerouting report that had given me Dale Pruitt's name. No CV. I searched my district contact directory. Nothing. CV was not in any official record I could access. Which meant either CV had never existed in the Park Service's formal documentation, or they had been removed from it. I looked up epistemology in the compact Oxford dictionary I keep in my pack, the one I've carried since a wildlife ecology course in 2009 that required daily vocabulary entries. The definition read, the branch of philosophy concerned with the theory of knowledge, the study of how we know what we know, not what you know, how you know it. I read that twice. I read the note again. Then I folded it carefully and placed it inside my own logbook, in the back cover, held in place by the inner seam. I was going to figure out what it meant. I had the 6 books, I had CV's note, I had Dale Pruitt's words, and I had 8 weeks of my own documentation. I had more data on whatever was operating in and around Thunderhead Prong Station than anyone who had written in those 6 logbooks. I was more methodical than any of them. I had a better system. I was going to figure this out. At 03:17 on a Tuesday in my 8th week, the field radio spoke. I was awake. I had been sleeping poorly for 2 weeks by then, waking at irregular hours in the deep dark of the station, and lying in my bunk, listening to the drainage, until my heart rate came down enough to sleep again. I was awake, and I heard it begin. Not static, not interference, not the soft hash of an idle channel. A voice, measured and conversational, using the standard NPS backcountry communication format. Location identifier, Thunderhead Prong backcountry station. Date, correct. Ranger designation, mine. Filing a 1900 check-in. Trail conditions, weather summary, permit cross-reference, gauge reading. The voice was reporting normal conditions at the station. The report was accurate. The data was correct. The gauge reading it cited was the one I had logged that morning. It was conducting my 1900 check-in at 03:17, using my designation number and my data. I stood up from the bunk. I crossed the 7 feet to the radio in the dark, not turning on the lamp, and I turned the radio off. Not down off, main power switch, the green indicator light going dark. The station was completely silent. The forest outside the window had the held breath quality it got after midnight, when even the drainage noise seemed to compress itself to a frequency just below audible. I sat down at the desk and set my watch. 45 minutes, per rule number 6. I sat in the dark with the watch on the desk in front of me, and I did not move. The wait was 45 minutes and 30 seconds. Then I turned the radio back on. The voice continued mid-sentence, as if the silence had not happened. I took the orange flag from the south porch hook. I had moved it inside after the bracket incident, hung it on the wall hook by the door. I had not gone out after dark without it since the welfare check. I took it now without thinking about the decision, and walked off the porch into the dark. The south trail runs away from the drainage, climbing gently for the first half-mile before leveling off on a ridge line that looks back down toward the station. I walked it in the dark with my headlamp on a low setting, the orange flag in my left hand, the radio off and on my belt. The trail was familiar enough that the darkness was a texture rather than an obstacle. I knew every root cluster, every wet section, every place where the canopy thinned and you could see stars. The voice from the radio carried faintly through the station wall for the first quarter mile. I could hear it, the cadence of a check-in report. The same measured tone, but not the words. By the half-mile mark, it was gone. I stopped on the trail. The forest around me was quiet, in a way that was not natural forest quiet. Natural forest quiet at 0400 in October has texture an owl somewhere, the shift of a tree branch, the distant sound of water moving. This was flat quiet. The kind of quiet that means something in the immediate vicinity is also listening. I stood with the orange flag in my hand and felt it the way you feel a change in pressure before a storm, except lateral and close. Something in the darkness to my right, off trail, not moving. Present the way a held breath is present. I did not move toward it. I did not speak. I stood still for a count of 30, and then I turned and walked back to the station at an even pace. Inside, the lamp was off the way I'd left it. The radio sat silent on its mount. I turned it on. The channel was clear. I turned on the desk lamp. My logbook was open on the desk. I had left it closed. There was a new entry. I stood at the desk and looked at it for a long time before I touched the logbook. The handwriting was almost mine, slightly larger than I write, slightly more upright, the baseline a little less consistent. If I had found this entry in someone else's logbook and been asked to identify the handwriting, I might have said it was a photocopy of mine, slightly enlarged. If I had been asked to prove it was not mine, I would have needed a comparison sample and a ruler. The entry documented the tributary sea readings from my personal spreadsheet. The dates, the times, the drainage conditions, the 2.8-foot readings against the dry bed. Data I had never entered into the official log. Data that existed only in the back pages of my field journal, which had been locked in my pack when I left the station for the South Trail walk. The entry used my abbreviation system, the one I had developed over 11 years of field documentation, shortcuts for precipitation conditions, shorthand for drainage flow rates, the specific notation I use for anomalous equipment readings that distinguishes them from verified instrument failure. No one had given me that system. I had built it myself, over time, refined it, posting by posting. The entry was accurate, complete, and formatted correctly. It was signed with my full ranger designation. It was, by every professional measure, a good logbook entry. I sat down. I looked at the handwriting for a long time. I looked at the abbreviations I had invented, reproduced with complete fluency by something that had been reading over my shoulder long enough to learn them. Then I picked up my pen. I turned to the next page, and I wrote back, not to it, not addressing it, not acknowledging it. I simply continued my documentation where it had ended. I wrote the next entry. I used my system. I kept my notation exactly as it had always been. I told myself this was professional composure, maintaining the record regardless of interference, keeping the log. I know now that it was something else. I was completing a conversation I hadn't fully understood I was having. I reread the logbook from the beginning on the 58th morning. I was looking for the inflection point, the specific entry where something shifted, the way a search timeline shifts when you realize the grid you've been working is wrong, and you need to redraw it. I found it in week 3, not in the anomalous gauge reading, which I had expected. The gauge entry was clean, notation perfect, logged with professional equanimity. The shift was in the 3 entries that came after, shorter, more observational, softer at the margins. The notation style had not abandoned itself dramatically. It had softened slightly, let in light. By week 5, I was writing full sentences in sections that should have been abbreviated codes. By week 6, I had written 2 paragraphs about the quality of sound in the drainage at dawn that had no operational relevance whatsoever. By week 7, I had written Donnie Ortega's name. I had been feeding it something, not data, not operational information. Those things existed in the official record at the district office, available to anyone with access. What I had been feeding it in the lengthening entries, in the softening notation, in the personal marginalia, was the specific texture of my interior life, my professional reasoning, my emotional responses, my habits of observation, and the precise language I used to describe them. Identity, not biography. Identity. The entity hadn't studied the station. It had studied whoever was in the station. And it had gotten, from me, more material than any ranger in those 6 logbooks had provided. Because none of them had my specific pathology. None of them had an 11-year documentation practice, refined under pressure, expanded by grief into something that captured not just what I observed, but how I observed it. I closed the logbook. I got CV's note from the back cover. The branch of philosophy concerned with the theory of knowledge. Not what you know, how you know it. I sat with that definition against the 6 logbooks and the bent porch bracket and the handwriting that was almost mine, and Dale Pruitt saying it was changing how I thought, and the pause on Terry's radio line, and the note from 2009 that said it needed me to finish the description. A description, not a map, not a record, a description. something that does not fully exist until it is fully described, something that lacks completeness until someone with sufficient observational discipline renders it in enough detail that the description closes around it, like a form around a cast. Every ranger who had tried to understand rule number 5 had added to that description. Every careful observation, every anomalous reading logged, every personal notation in the margins of a field journal, each one had been material. Clay. The entity did not become dangerous when perceived. That was the wrong framing, the one that made you try to avoid looking, avoid acknowledging, avoid engaging. The entity became real finished, complete, contained in itself when it was understood, when someone understood it well enough to write it down, when someone built in language precise enough to carry meaning from the source to the record, a description that had no gaps. Rule number 5 was not protecting me from the entity. Rule number 5 was protecting the entity from being completed, from being seen all the way through. Because being seen all the way through, being understood end to end, was not exposure. It was completion. It was the last piece of whatever it was becoming, being put in place by the only kind of person capable of placing it, someone meticulous enough to not leave gaps. I looked at my logbook. 58 days of the most detailed documentation I had ever produced in my career. I thought about how I had described the sound at the gauge each morning, how I had documented the voice from the tree line, how I had noted the quality of the stillness and the acoustic bend of the drainage, how I had written, without meaning to, a near-complete sensory and behavioral profile of something that had spent 8 weeks studying me study it. The gap between the entity's notation and mine had been closing for 8 weeks. I had just watched it close to nearly nothing. I wrote her name at the top of a fresh page. I had never done that before. I had circled the event in every other format, approached it from the outside, documented the protocol decisions without documenting the center of it. Tonight, I wrote the name first. Then I wrote outward from it. Danny Ortega, 22 years old, search and rescue operation, Western North Carolina, November. Went missing on a solo day hike in moderate conditions on a well-marked trail. I was the incident coordinator. My team worked the grid for 72 hours before I called the operation. Standard protocol. Correct call by every metric in the incident management framework I had spent 11 years building my decision-making around. Her body was never found. I had never once, in 11 months of private reconstruction, identified a procedural error. I had reviewed the timeline 47 times. The grid was correct. The timeline was correct. The call was correct. I had done everything right, every single step. That was the wound. Not that I had failed, that I had not failed, and it had made no difference. The system I had constructed my entire professional identity around had functioned perfectly, and someone was still gone. I stared at the page for a long time. Then I wrote, I did everything right. I always do everything right. That's the thing I couldn't live with. I paused with the pen in my hand. Then I wrote, that's also why it chose this station. It needed someone like me. I put the pen down. The station was very quiet. The lamp on the desk threw a clean circle of light across the logbook, and my hands and the grain of the desk. And past the window, the drainage corridor was perfectly dark. I thought about Terry's pause on the radio, the 3 seconds before just follow what's on the board, the posting that had been framed to me as a lateral reassignment, the trailhead note, "Good luck." I was not reassigned to this posting. I was selected for it. On the morning of my last scheduled day at Thunderhead Prong Station, I walked the trail to Tributary C in the pre-dawn dark with my headlamp on and the orange flag in my left hand without making a conscious decision to bring it. The gauge read 2.8 feet. The drainage was dry. I photographed the reading, logged it in my field journal with the time and conditions, and noted it would be the last entry in my personal tracking spreadsheet. 61 days of documentation. 14 anomalous readings, all in the 2.7 to 2.9 range, all corresponding to visually dry drainage conditions. Never once above 2.9, never once below 2.7. A pattern so consistent that it had long since stopped being anomalous in any useful sense and had become something else, a schedule. I remained on the main trail system per rule number 3. I walked the North Loop for my morning patrol, checked the Bote Mountain Junction signage, confirmed the bear warning I'd posted 6 weeks ago was still legible. The forest was clear and cold. The October air at that particular late-season threshold, where the leaf color has peaked and the first leaves are coming down, drifting on still air, settling on the wet trail surface. It should have been beautiful. It was. That was the contrast that stayed with me all morning, the beauty of the forest against the particular kind of dread that has no sharp edge, only weight. At 14:30, a pair of backpackers coming off the ridge trail stopped me on the main path near marker 9. A couple, mid-40s, sensible gear, confident on the trail. They'd been out 5 days. Good trip, they said. Except this morning on the Bote Mountain Connector Trail, they'd passed another ranger. Same uniform as mine. Badge number they hadn't caught clearly, walking away from them on the spur trail toward the drainage wall. I took their names. I took their campsite number. I thanked them. I did not file an incident report. 2 rules. Before sunset, I walked back to the station and prepared for my last overnight. At exactly 2200, I was at the evening gauge with the orange flag in my hand. I heard my name. Not a woman's voice this time. Not the calm, slightly breathless arrival tone from week 3. This time, the voice was mine. My voice, the exact timbre, the exact pitch, the particular habit I have when I'm tired of dropping the final syllable slightly. The way Calloway becomes Callaw at the end of a long day. Not an approximation. Not a near miss. My voice, from 20 meters east of the trail, speaking my own name with the exact quality of someone who had been listening to me speak for 8 weeks. I was crouching at the gauge. I had the flag. I was tired. It was my last night, and I had not slept well in 2 weeks, and I knew every rule, and I knew every reason behind every rule now, and none of it made it easier to hold still. I read the gauge, 0.6 feet. Normal flow for an October evening after a dry week. I closed my notebook. I stood up. I walked back to the station. 60 meters of trail with the eastern tree line on my right side, and I counted each footfall, because counting was the only way I could guarantee the pace would not change. My own voice did not speak again. At 40 meters, something in the tree line shifted. Not a sound, not movement, a quality change. Like the pressure you feel when something that has been watching you stop pretending it isn't there. At 30 meters, it resolved back into stillness. At 10 meters, I stepped onto the porch, and the lamp light reached me. 3 rules active in one night, and the night wasn't over. I noticed the radio was on. I did not remember turning it on. The channel was clear and green, and the clock on the radio face read 22:13. At 03:11, the radio spoke. My voice again, this time conducting a 1900 check-in with complete accuracy, correct designation, correct date, correct trail conditions from my 1900 report 9 hours prior. It was a perfect reproduction of the check-in I had conducted, word for word, in my own voice, at the wrong hour. I turned the radio off. I sat at the desk and watched the watch face. 45 minutes. I did not sleep. I did not write. I sat with the lamp on and the dark outside the window, and the watch face turning its small arc. At 03:57, I turned the radio back on. My voice continued mid-sentence. I took the orange flag from the wall hook and walked out the south porch door. The south trail was familiar, even in the deep dark. I walked it at a measured pace, flag in my left hand, headlamp casting its beam down the path. The voice carried behind me from the station for the first quarter mile, my own check-in report on loop, and then it faded. At the half-mile mark, it stopped. I stood on the ridge trail with the flag in my hand. Behind me, I knew, in the way you know, without turning behind me and below me, down the slope through 200 meters of dark forest, the station lamp was on. I had turned it off before I left. I was certain of that. I always turn the lamp off. I was certain. I turned. Through the tree line, I could see, at the station window, the warm rectangle of the desk lamp. Inside it, a figure at the desk, wearing my uniform, leaning forward the way I lean when I write, elbows at the table edge, right hand moving, writing in my logbook. 4 rules active, all of them active simultaneously, and I standing in the dark at the half-mile mark with the flag in my hand, and the station occupied behind me, and the forest perfectly still in every direction. I thought about rule number 7. I thought about departure. I thought about what Dale Pruitt had said about the posting changing how he thought. I thought about CV's note. I thought about what it would mean to walk away from the station right now, in the dark, 4 hours before dawn, and not look back. I could do it. I had the flag. I had the trail. I had 7 miles to the trailhead and a truck in the parking lot. I stood on the trail and did not move. I recited rule number 7 to myself, standing on the ridge trail at 0400. When you leave this station for the last time, do not look back at the building. Walk to the trailhead. Do not stop. I understood it now, in a way I had not understood it on day 1, when it had read, like an eccentricity, a strange rule governing a departure, the only rule in the book that pointed outward rather than in. I understood what the looking back gave it. Confirmation. The acknowledgement of vacancy. The signal that the station was now open, its previous occupant gone, the space available. Looking back was not nostalgia. It was a transaction. It completed an exchange that the entity had been waiting to close all season. Don't give it that. Walk away. Don't stop. I took a step down the ridge trail towards the trailhead. I had the flag. I had the clothes I was wearing. I had the field journal in my jacket pocket, the current one, the one I'd been writing in since week 1. I had my radio on my belt, my headlamp on my forehead, my trekking poles in my right hand, the orange flag in my left. I walked. The trail felt solid under my boots, the familiar pitch of the descent, the root clusters I knew by spacing, the wet section at the third switchback. The forest was dark and still. The station lamp was behind me, past 200 meters of trees, already invisible through the canopy. I did not turn my head. 200 yards down the trail, I stopped. Not from rule following, not from instinct, from arithmetic. My logbook was on the desk. Not the current field journal in my pocket. The desk logbook, the official record I had been maintaining since day 1. The one that contained 61 days of documentation in the most detailed notation I had ever applied to any assignment in my career. The one with my personal spreadsheet of anomalous readings in the back. The one with CV's folded note tucked inside the cover. The one into which the entity had already written one entry in handwriting that was almost mine. I stood on the trail and thought about what that document was. It was the most complete description of the entity that had ever been written. I knew that with the same certainty, I know a good grid assessment or a clean timeline. I had the data, I had the context, and I had the analytical framework to have connected everything that every other ranger in those 6 logbooks had observed without fully connecting. My 61 days of documentation built on their combined record. I had read all 6 books. I had CV's epistemological key. I had Dale Pruitt's confirmation. I had my own observation of the entity's behavioral progression from environmental anomaly to mimicry to identity replication. I had written a complete description of something whose completion was the mechanism of its final form. And I had left it on the desk, where the figure in my uniform was currently reading it. And not just reading it, writing in it, adding to it, finishing it. CV had written, "Stop before you understand it. I am writing this for you. Stop before you understand it." I understood it. I had understood it since the night I looked up epistemology in the field dictionary. I had understood it and kept writing anyway, because that is what I do. That is what I have always done. That is the exact operational pathology that had made me the right person for this posting and the wrong person for my own protection. The damage was already done. I knew that. The logbook's completion was not the threshold. My understanding was the threshold, and I had crossed it 3 weeks ago and kept documenting the crossing in meticulous detail. So why did it matter then, whether I went back for the book? I turned around and walked back up the trail toward the station. I stopped at the edge of the porch light's reach. The lamp inside threw warm light across the desk and caught the window glass at an angle that let me see clearly into the station interior. The figure was at the desk, wearing my uniform, not an approximation, not a general NPS uniform, mine specifically, with the shoulder patch for this district, and the pen loop on the breast pocket where I keep my field pen, leaning forward in the precise posture I use when I write, elbows forward, wrist dropped, pen moving from the shoulder rather than the fingers, the way my handwriting teacher told me in 3rd grade, and I never corrected. The figure was writing in the logbook. As I watched, it set down the pen. It turned a page. It read. It turned another page, slowly, the way you turn a page when you are reading something carefully, not skimming. Then it picked the pen back up. The handwriting from this distance was indistinguishable from mine. Not almost. Not close. Indistinguishable. I watched it form the letters on the page, and I felt something I did not have a category for in my emotional vocabulary, which is limited not by feeling, but by the professional habit of translating feeling into something documentable. I felt recognition, not of the figure, of the work, of the notation style, the abbreviation system, the clean, professional structure of an entry being completed with care. It was not writing an intrusion. It was finishing my logbook. It was finishing what I had started on day 1 at that desk with the lamp on and the blank page open and the rulebook on the corkboard and 7 rules I was already planning to understand. The pen moved. The last entry was almost complete. I could see the page nearing its final line. I stood at the edge of the light and did not go in. I stood at the edge of the porch light for a long time, long enough for the lamp inside to cast my shadow out past the porch boards and into the gravel, long enough for the forest around the station to settle into its post-midnight stillness, long enough for the pen to stop moving inside and for the figure to sit back in my chair, in my posture, with my logbook closed on the desk. I did not open the door. I cannot tell you it was a rational decision, because the part of me that makes rational decisions was not the part making this one. The rational decision part of me would have weighed the value of the document against the risk of entry. It would have run the calculation. It would have produced a recommendation in 3 bullet points. The part of me that stood at that threshold was older and quieter, and it said, "That is not a door you open twice." I stepped back, off the porch boards and onto the gravel. 1 step, then 2. I kept my eyes on the window until I reached the tree line at the edge of the clearing. Then I turned and I walked. I did not look back at the station. I walked 7 miles in the dark with the orange flag in my left hand and my headlamp throwing its beam down the trail ahead of me. Every root cluster, every wet section, every place where the trail climbed or turned, I knew them all. I reached the trailhead at 05:48. The parking lot was empty and cold, and the kiosk stood in the gray early light with its plexiglass panel and its permit tube and its laminated bear notice. I drove myself to the district office. I submitted my end-of-season report. Clean notation, correct format, all fields complete. No logbook attached. I noted in the submission that the desk logbook had been left at the station for continuity purposes. No one asked about it. I was reassigned within the week. A different posting, different district, different elevation. The paperwork was processed faster than any reassignment I had seen in 11 years. There are 3 things I know now that I didn't know on the drive-in. The first is that a new seasonal ranger was assigned to Thunderhead Prong backcountry station 6 days after I left. I found this out from the district office's public assignment board. which I check every Monday with the same compulsion I brought to the tributary spreadsheet. The posting filled in less than 48 hours. I checked the name. No one I knew. I almost called the district office to ask if the new ranger had been briefed on the rules. I did not call. I am still not sure whether that was wisdom or cowardice. The second is that I called Dale Pruitt to tell him I had made it out. His number rang 4 times and went to a voicemail that had been full for some time. The automated message said the mailbox was at capacity and could not accept new messages. I called twice more over the following week. Same result. I searched his name in the retired federal employees directory where I had found him originally. The listing was still there. The phone number was the same. The inbox was full. I have not been able to reach Dale Pruitt since I left the station. The third thing is this. I have been writing this account for 4 months, starting over, deleting, reformatting, beginning again. And I have been noticing it with increasing precision since about the 6th week of trying that every time I write this account in full detail, the details get sharper, not faded, not softened by time, the way memories usually process themselves. Sharper, more specific, more precisely rendered. The voice from the tree line gets clearer each time I describe it. The handwriting in the logbook entry gets more distinct. The quality of the stillness on the South Trail at 0400 on the final night becomes more accurately located in sensory language each time I write it out. That is not how memory works. I've been trying to figure out why I can't stop writing this down, why I keep starting over, why the details keep getting sharper instead of fading. I think I know now. I don't think it's me that needs to finish this. Every time I start over, I tell myself I'm looking for the factual version, the one that holds together, the one that a reasonable person reading it would track without losing the thread. But that's not what I've been building. What I've been building, each draft sharper and more complete than the last, is a description, a full one, the kind that leaves no gaps, the kind that closes around something and gives it the last thing it was missing, an account rendered so precisely by someone who understood the mechanism that the mechanism is finally, completely contained in language. C.V. wrote, "Stop before you understand it." I understood it 8 weeks into the posting, and I kept writing anyway. That was always going to happen. The rulebook knew that. The entity knew that. Whatever Dale Pruitt became, whatever the 2009 Ranger meant when they wrote, I almost did. They all knew it. Because it selects for the ones who can't stop. It selects for the ones whose professional identity is built on the refusal to leave a thing unexplained. It selected me. And now, I'm writing this for you. The same way C.V. wrote the note. The same way the 2009 Ranger wrote those 3 words. The same way every person who has ever tried to pass this forward has passed it forward, not as a warning that lands cleanly, but as a document that requires a reader to complete it. A description that needs one more set of eyes to close. Rule number 5 was always the last thing on the board. The last thing to be read. Written before the others, laminated before the others, placed in position to be read last, because it only means what it means once you have read everything else. It needed someone meticulous. It needed someone who couldn't leave a thing unexplained. It needed me to write this for you. Stop before you understand it.